one of the best things I got from Owen Lee when I was studying with him is basically giving yourself time to make it easy.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I'm so glad to have you here today as we kick off our audition week. We are covering 3 recent audition winners and digging into the tactics, tools, strategies, high points, low points in their auditioning journey. And we are rounding out the week with a series of highlights from the past audition winners I've been chatting with since putting out my book, Winning the Audition. So I'm really excited to have you here this week. And we kick off the week with Jon McCullough-Benner, who is the recent winner of the principal bass position of the Milwaukee Symphony. And he comes to the Milwaukee Symphony from being principal bass of the Oregon Symphony. He's also the assistant principal bass of the Grant Park Symphony, and he's recently joined the faculty at the Chicago College of Performing Arts at Roosevelt University, where my wife went to school, incidentally, on harp, not bass. And we dig into all kinds of topics, like the process that Jon went through winning another job while holding down a full-time job. That's a question that I've been asked many times in the past, and it's quite a different process than when you're in school. We also talk about studying with Owen Lee, Laszlo, why quarter note equals 60 practice, slow practice, why that's such a great number for Jon. His early bird gets the worm philosophy. And we also talk about Ian Hallis, who's a member of the Lyric Opera of Chicago, and Colin Corner, who's the latest winner for Jon's job, the principal bass of the Oregon Symphony. So if you hear us talking about Ian and Jon, that's who we're talking about. Now, before we get rolling, I'd like to thank our sponsor, D'Addario Strings, and I'd love to have you enter our giveaway for Kaplan Strings. D'Addario is giving away 10 sets of Kaplan Strings to Contrabass Conversations listeners. Kaplans are stranded steel core strings that provide clarity and warmth in all registers. They've got a rich tonal color palette, they're beautifully balanced, and they are played by musicians like David Allen Moore of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Michael Valerio, who you've heard on countless movie soundtracks, Oscar Meza of LA Phil, Volkan Orhan, bass professor at Iowa, so many great players, Kurt Muroki at Indiana University, the list goes on and on. Like all D'Addario strings, they're made in their New York factory here in the United States, and you can get them in light, medium, heavy tension, and solo tuning. So thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. And thank you also to the Bass Violin Shop, which offers the Southeast's largest inventory of basses, laminate, hybrid, and carved double basses. So whether you're in search of the best entry-level laminate bass or a fine pedigree instrument, there's always a unique selection for you to try at the Bass Violin Shop. Trade-ins and consignments are welcome, and they also have a great selection of bows. So if you're looking for a French bow, German bow, entry-level bow, all the way up to a Fretschner or any other name maker, the Bass Violin Shop's a great place to look. And all those bows are personally selected prior to sale to ensure that customers can choose from the very best. Check them out at bassviolinshop.com. And thank you to Rosin Saver, which I've been using for the last several months. It has kept my pops feeling as fresh as the day it was made. And it's used by not just me, by lots of bass players like members of the New York Philharmonic, the Met Orchestra, Los Angeles Philharmonic, Cleveland Orchestra, Seattle Symphony, Toronto Symphony Orchestra, and the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra. And you can enter the code HEATH, H-E-A-T-H, at rosinsaver.com and get 10% off any and all orders. That's, again, rosinsaver.com, promo code HEATH. Now, you're going to be hearing Jon playing duets with Andy Anderson, who's a former podcast guest and Jon's colleague, both at the Grant Park Symphony and at Roosevelt University. And these duets are from the 2017 Chicago Bass Festival. So without further ado, here is our interview with Jon McCullough-Benner. Something that people have asked me over and over is how it's one thing when you're auditioning and you're trying to get a job in school, right? And you have more free time. But you're taking these auditions, like you were getting ready for Milwaukee and you had a job. And this might seem like a weird spot to start, but it could open up some interesting topics. Like,
sure.
How was your practicing for the Milwaukee job different from when you were auditioning for things when you didn't have a job?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I have to say, like, probably the biggest thing that changed between preparing for the job, like when I was preparing for Oregon Symphony, when I was in school at IU, and preparing for Milwaukee, essentially while I was starting at Grant Park, is, after having a full-time job and preparing these lists, is kind of developing the perspective of essentially developing the context as far as, like, say, what the committee is going to want to hear, who is going to be on the committee, what they're going to be listening for, as far as, kind of looking at bass parts more from like a score point of view as opposed to just the bass part. So that, like, say, one of the excerpts that I've, worked on with students a lot is, like, say first movement 1 start 39. Filling in all the holes, like, say, where you have rests or dotted half notes, filling in, or at least, keeping in mind, say the first violin part and how that relates. And so in my preparation for Milwaukee, I did a lot of, and of course, I did this in school too, but a lot of listening and being able to, while I'm practicing, be able to hear everything else that's going on in the orchestra in my head, so that, when it comes time to actually perform it or do a mock or whatever, this might sound a little cheesy, but it kind of completes the groove. So in really completing, what the orchestra needs to feel, it just helps get the excerpt going on a totally different level. Whereas, like in school, it's one thing to just play super, super well, but after having a job, the context is really what made the difference, at least for me. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the biggest thing. And of course, with Grant Park, I mean, you're playing all the time. Like, it's, if you've got 5 hours of rehearsal, like doubles almost every day, that, of course, kind of forces you to manage your time well when you actually are able to get to the practice room, so that you're not just, like, wasting time doing anything unnecessary. So otherwise, I mean, you're going to hurt yourself.
Right. Yeah. I mean, those 5 hour day, like, what would you do in the practice room? And it's probably different from day to day, but, like, if you had one of those double days, how much time would you spend in the practice room? What would you work on? Like, you were getting ready for an audition. So how did that all work for you?
Well, actually, I mean, it's basically one of my strongest beliefs is, kind of the early bird gets the worm sort of things. And so because Grant Park started at, all the rehearsals start at 11 or 10:30 at the earliest, because of that, as long as I was able to get up and, get on the red line at 7, I was able to get in, a good 2.5 or 3 hours of practice time in before rehearsal. And so I did a lot of that, basically getting done what I really needed to in order to preserve my chops in the list before rehearsal, before you have to go to the grind. And so in trying to preserve muscles for that, essentially all I did was slow practicing in those hours. It's actually kind of funny. Ever since I studied with Owen Lee and actually my teacher before that, Mark Barnard, like, it was all about slow practicing as far as, giving your brain a little bit more time to process. And so for almost the entire summer, my metronome didn't leave 60 beats per minute. And so, like, I almost practiced every excerpt on the list. I mean, I played through every excerpt every day at that tempo, whether it be, 60 equals the quarter or, dotted half or something. It's kind of the perfect number to just dial everything down so that, you just have that much more time to think about stuff.
Yeah, what is it about that number 60? I've had people that has come up again and again, and I noticed myself. That's where I start. I wonder what it is about that number. Is it that like I have an Apple Watch and I track all my exercise and whatever, and I think a real relaxed heartbeat is maybe almost that. I don't know. Do you have any theory on that, or is it just one of those something about seconds? I don't know. It's something I've thought about a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I have too, actually, because it's funny. My brother actually made a joke with me because he witnessed a little bit of my practicing throughout the summer, so I was able to actually see my folks quite a bit. And so when he was around, he basically just told me to get a giant, really loud clock, and that would do just the same thing as what I was using.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's I don't know if it has to do with a relaxed heartbeat or what, but it's kind of just this magic number. I mean, of course, when if you do have that relaxed heartbeat, I know it, when I've gone to the doctor and stuff, resting pulse is usually around 60. And so maybe that has something to do with it, being super relaxed or something. I don't know. I mean, not any concrete theory, I should say.
Right. No, I love that.
It just kind of just works.
Yeah, I love the idea of just getting a giant loud clock instead.
Yeah.
It sort of forces you to not. So that's at what point, getting ready, maybe we could just take Milwaukee as an example. At what point do you leave that 60 pulse and start playing things at tempo? Is that only when you're playing a mock audition, or maybe what does the rest of your what did the rest of your prep process look like for that audition?
Okay, so essentially every day, I mean, as I said before, basically, I did 60 beats per minute on everything, literally every excerpt on that list every day. But because the Grant Park guys are, total bass geeks, I say that lovingly, I was able to do mocks for them all the time. I could usually do a mock audition every day if I wanted to. And thankfully with Ian doing a 1 year this past summer and, Colin being new, all three of us were pretty fresh in the audition scene. And so I was able to play for them a lot, as well as Tim, John, Chris. I mean, everybody in the section was willing to hear me do, a couple excerpts, pretty much every day. And so that's when I left the metronome. If I was doing a mock or if I wanted to record myself doing the list, that's when I would leave 60 to really see, okay, what holds up. Now, of course, in preparation, in actually learning the excerpts for the first time, you do sort of have to work it up. But after doing them for long enough, it's almost, not to say it's unnecessary, but it's not necessarily a step that you need to do all the time. And so, yeah, it was kind of it's a dramatic change from, just practicing with the metronome at 60 and doing the mock, but it almost highlights a lot of the things that you just kind of need to keep your ear on.
I remember somebody who saw Heifetz play live saying that what they saw Heifetz do is he'd be backstage and he'd play through his repertoire half tempo or passages at half tempo. They never heard him play a lick at tempo in his life, not on stage. Then he'd get on stage and it'd be very fast Heifetz tempos. But that, must have been under his fingers. That slow practice just sort of connected the neural, passageways, however necessary, most effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally a believer in that. Well, and I mean, it's one of the best things I got from Owen Lee when I was studying with him is basically just giving yourself time to make it easy. At the end of the day, everything on whatever list you're working on needs to be easy. And so that the committee on the other side of the screen can say, okay, this guy isn't struggling at all with this. This guy knows what he's doing. And so, in studying with Owen, almost if there was a problem with something, every time it would just be, okay, slow it down to this. And it helped iron things out faster. So, yeah, and I was actually one of the good things about studying with Al Laszlo, too, is his whole belief in the Galamian system, doing a lot of the kind of connect the dots while changing rhythms, or just, basically boiling everything down so that you have complete control no matter what. Like with his whole workbook is gold. And basically just, zoning in on the technique so that when it comes time to go to the real repertoire, it all is there. There's like no question about it.
I think you might be the first person I've interviewed that did their undergrad with Al Laszlo. Ira Gold worked with him a bit at Aspen and some other people, and I haven't had the opportunity to interview him yet. But I mean, everything I've heard sort of reinforces that amazing technical foundation and focus. Yeah. Can you maybe just and I've looked through his workbook and wow, could you maybe just talk through some of what you did, or the Galamian? I'm familiar with the Galamian system and how that works, but what did he have you do as an undergrad technically?
Oh man, where do I start?
I know.
It's essentially his whole belief. It's very much focused on almost it's very similar to Owen's approach, which is interesting. In that, basically, if you approach the instrument with having a super grounded, supported body, when you go to the bass, everything is you have a lot more control over your movement and your input into the instrument. So a lot of what we started with was just having support and basically approaching the instrument with the right posture. And so everybody is going to be different with that, but in order to do it right, it took us a bit to experiment and really figure out, okay, this is what's going to work for you and your body. So we spent a lot of time on that. And he, of course, if you're familiar with the workbook, there are a lot of exercises. They boil down techniques so that, like I said, you have control, but his slow bow exercise and doing super legato slow bow string crossings, it forces you to have good technique. And so in order to figure out how to do the exercise, you had to figure out how to do it right. And so that was kind of the approach with his whole method is, in order to complete those exercises, you had to figure it out one way or another. But it always involved being more relaxed and essentially figuring out how to let the instrument talk back to you in a way, so that, the instrument can essentially be, it's kind of like a two-way street. If you're just inputting into the instrument, the sound might be a little harsh, whereas, if you just let it happen and let it talk back, both in left hand and right hand, everything will just be so much cleaner in its place almost. And so throughout my entire undergrad, technique-wise, it's essentially big picture. That's what he did. He did a lot of, he incorporates a lot of violin exercises. We kind of talked about with Galamian, changing around rhythms. He has this whole permutation thing where, basically if you have a set of 4 notes, taking each chunk of 4, using that whole chunking method. Say you have a set of 4 16ths that you really need to iron out. So put those set of 4 notes into a bar of 3/4. Call the first note a dotted quarter, and the rest are eighths. And then not every time you go through it, but as you iron it out, keep putting eighth notes in front, so that you have that long note sit on each of those 4 at some point. There was a lot of that, but also I have to say, once you figured out your technique, that's when a lot of Laszlo's really gold ideas came out in terms of, the romantic side of him, in a way that, especially his approach to visualizing music. One of the best lessons I had with him, I was preparing for, I forget which audition it was. It might have been Grand Rapids or something a few years ago. I was playing Hinastera, and his imagery is awesome. As far as describing, kind of helping you develop your own image for things, like picturing a desert, or say that like that run up to the high E being jumping off a cliff and you discovering that you have wings or something. That sort of visualization. I mean, that was great.
That creative visualization you're talking about. I love that. And I feel like Don Green, and maybe in Performance Success, one of his books talks about that a bit too. Like, is that something you carried over later on in life? Like, did you have specific visualizations for particular pieces or excerpts? How does that work for you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, totally. I kind of approach excerpts, especially in conveying, like I was talking about, like groove, or really setting it up so that, the committee will know that is just one piece of context. So, like, for every excerpt, I basically picked out, without making it too complicated, I picked out, say, 3 descriptive words that would kind of dive into the emotional side of things. Like for the Beethoven 5 trio or something, it has to be bombastic, but also joyful in being in C major, and just, very stately. Like, having those kind of descriptors helps really get into the zone. That wasn't necessarily anything. I mean, Laszlo did help develop a little bit of that, but that's something over the years that I've kind of developed, especially working with so many different conductors and starting, full-time jobs, kind of seeing the way they look at things as far as, conveying emotion in music, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make you stand out. Yeah, I mean, that is definitely something I carried over. I guess the nuts and bolts of how I get into the zone, but every time I work up a new list, I try to come up with something new to add to that. So not necessarily using those same words every time, so that every time you go to it, you have this fresh approach. And the other thing that I tell a lot of my students is the approach to making music that way is almost like that of an actor. Really understanding what you need to portray is, if it's not totally convincing, it's like you're going to be a soap opera actor. Whereas if you're really going for a really big role, or like say the solo from Kiji or something, if you really get emotionally invested, it'll come across in just the kind of soul that you put into it. I'm totally a believer in all that stuff, and it even in recordings, like when I was recording myself, that really was developed as I started working full time.
Being in rehearsals with conductors and hearing different and playing through pieces and hearing different metaphors and descriptive, you think that all like sort of contributed to that sort of musical. So I mean, I love what you're describing, because it's that, like, I think we get so tied into rhythm and pitch and just those fundamentals, which obviously you need, but that's such a different thing than what an actor or a halfway decent actor is probably thinking. They're not thinking like, how am I going to enunciate every word, right? That's like maybe the base level, but they're thinking way beyond that into like the emotional realm, like you're describing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's, the more you don't have to think about the fundamentals, that much more energy you can devote to actually making music and conveying your approach to, okay, this is how this goes. This is how I like to play this. I hope you like it too. Sort of approach. Yeah, I mean, especially with, auditions and stuff, it's getting tied up too much into those fundamentals of, rhythm and intonation and stuff. The committee will know that. When I was in Oregon Symphony, we had a couple auditions for, we had a cello audition and also a violin audition right before the Milwaukee audition I took. And those were very telling as far as, you could tell where the player's mind was as far as what they were thinking about in a way. So steering away from those basics and being able to really dive into music, it'll reach through the screen a little bit more. And actually, especially thinking about musicians on the committee, they want to be able to say, okay, I can play chamber music with this guy. Really being able to have that sort of connection.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting that you can hear that so clearly on the other side of the screen, especially for people who might be listening to this that haven't had the opportunity to be on the other side of the screen. Yeah, boy, does that change your perspective on just the whole auditioning process. I had the chance to be on a couple of committees of some regional orchestras. And boy, it was fascinating to just sort of like it totally changed the way I thought about preparing for auditions. And I love that you're talking about this slow motion 60 beats per minute kind of technical approach, but then also like the emotional and creative and affective side of music just being like the most crucial thing.
Yeah, I mean essentially like, the easier you make it for yourself, the more confidence you can have, like when you're going into this, whatever audition you're doing, you can have the confidence and say, okay, I worked my butt off on this. I know that I'm going to be able to go in there and have a good showing because I put in the right kind of work. And so that frees up a lot of, the emotional side of things so that in the moment, when you're in the audition, it all just kind of flows. That is probably one of the most important things that I developed as, I started really getting on the brink of winning things, is saying, I have my confirmed musical approach to all this stuff, making sure that in the moment it'll still be fresh, but being able to bank on all the technical stuff that you've done for hours in the practice room. I mean, it helps it flow.
And, I think that the stakes for auditioning are just so high in so many ways, right? Like this is like employment or non-employment. I've spent $1,000, $2,000, you name it, taken a week off to come out to this town, flown with my bass. I mean, did you ever struggle with like psyching yourself out with all those other pressures and auditions? Or like, how was it just keeping your eye on that musical goal that worked for you? How did that work?
I mean, yes, and keeping the eye on the prize is definitely helpful. Though I will say, I mean, when I took the audition here in Milwaukee, I almost did psych myself out, especially because I had to play all rounds. I started in the prelim round, and so knowing that like 7 minutes could have made or broken the whole summer, the lot of money from taking off work, flying to Milwaukee with the bass, staying, an extra few days in the hotel to be super, super calm. It's easy to get psyched out. But in order to distract, at least for me, when I was, distracting myself from that, I basically forced my mind to think about, all the preparation that I did. And having confidence in that, knowing it's the right kind of work that I need to be doing, and being able to go in there with, musical conviction. Knowing that when you go in there, knowing that you kind of owe it to yourself to showcase your musical vision to them. That helped distract me from those thoughts of, oh man, this could go either way. These 7 minutes are super, super important. If I screw up, then it's all over, sort of thing. Keeping the eye on the prize was super important.
Was Milwaukee self-contained within one day, or was it over a few days? How did that work?
Well, they did it. That audition was spread out over 2 days.
Okay.
And so the prelim round, they did it basically all day Sunday, but then semis and finals were the following morning. So the semifinal round, was it was about actually the same length as the prelim round, but then the final was actually split up into 3 parts. First, you started with your concerto with piano. Then once you were done with that, then you come out again and do all your excerpts. Then you go back downstairs in your warm-up room again, while they decide who they want to hear do chamber music. And so that Monday was a super long day, a lot of bass playing. And so yeah, that's essentially how that worked. Honestly, a super, super good test of being able to just keep rolling with the punches. And going in 4 times in one day, on and off stage. I'm sure it was very telling.
Talk about a feat of endurance, like to do, like, what did you do during those down times? Like let's just take that very long day where you're playing 4 times. I've been to many auditions where I hear people like playing Heldenleben at tempo, like, the moment they get into the room until they go out. My guess is you probably weren't doing that between every round. Maybe you were, probably not. Like what did you do with yourself, like on the bass mentally, even like did you eat bananas between, like how did you kind of self-care through that whole day?
Lots of bananas.
Really? Okay.
Lots of bananas,
okay.
Man. Oh yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's of course, like if you're hungry when you have to play anything important, your mind is going to wander. It's going to be harder to focus because of that distraction. And so I made sure that I had enough snacks, like bananas, all that sort of thing, water. Thankfully, right next to my warm-up room, there was a drinking fountain, so I could stay hydrated. Drinking a lot of water is super important. But as far as playing-wise and keeping my muscles in decent shape without overdoing it, I essentially just did whatever they were asking super, super slow, kind of like all of my previous preparation, so that, just take care of it in case your bridge gets knocked like a millimeter or something. You can kind of figure the bass out again on that particular day. Doing a lot of slow practicing, maybe 2 times tops. And if I really felt like I needed to start something, then it would have been just like starting the first couple measures to make sure it gets off on the right start. Like, Mozart 40, that famous first movement lick, making sure that that first run is basically, it helps you get on the right foot. So I did a little bit of that, but not too much. One of the things I kind of learned the hard way, I took this sub audition in Pittsburgh, I think it was like 5 years ago. They had one. And I took that and, for whatever reason, I think I was in my warm-up room for a good, like, solid 2 or 2.5 hours. The committee might have been, I think they took a break or something. And so I ended up overplaying a lot. So by the time I got on stage for that, things weren't working the way I wanted them to. And so there's a huge risk with overplaying in the warm-up room. Going into the audition, and going into the warm-up room, you need to be able to still have confidence and say, okay, really whatever is going to happen is in a way already decided. With all of your months of preparation and stuff. It's not like when you get into the warm-up room, you're going to have this epiphany of, how to do something right. And so when I did that Pittsburgh thing, I learned that lesson the hard way. That basically changed my whole approach with like what I do in the warm-up room.
Wow. Okay, so that was the moment. So like getting through that long day, the Monday with the 4 times, and then the previous day you had the prelim in the morning, and then you knew you were going to have to play the next day, maybe for a long time. Like what did you do with the rest of that Sunday? Like you played the audition, or you played the prelim round. How did you spend your time the rest of that day?
Well, actually, I think my prelim, it was actually a little later in the day.
Oh, okay.
So like earlier in the day when I was, still in my hotel room, I did just a lot of just touch-up work. That slow playing, just make sure all the ducks are in a row. And so after I advanced, essentially what I did was I just went back to my hotel room, threw on the TV, hung out, drank water, think I ate another banana, and then I just went over what was being asked in the semis the following morning, just super, super slow, a lot of mental practice, just going over it all, looking at all the details. But, other than touching the bass, it was just making sure that I was still relaxed and not psyching myself out. reminding myself that what is done, and that, going into, the semis in the morning, that I could just bank on, all the work that I did for the entire summer. So it was a lot of reminding myself not to get psyched out, essentially. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of that, but not a super complicated thing, just making sure that I was relaxed.
Do you, in terms of like just keeping your energy level up or getting through days like that, I mean, outside of like getting ready for an audition, were you into running, working out, anything like that? Did that play a role in your just life in general?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I mean, I used to be a runner many moons ago, but actually the most beneficial thing that I do, like in keeping myself in, physical enough shape, is doing a lot of yoga. And so like a lot of stretching, a little bit of the strength oriented poses, but basically doing just enough so that you kind of keep your body in check, not necessarily overdoing anything, so that, the rest of your time can be devoted to, the musical stuff. I found that super important, and especially for me, especially when I was younger, I tended to overthink things a lot. And so yoga for me was kind of a good way to calm the mind too, like the whole meditative side of things. Making sure that when I am doing my yoga routine, I'm not, blasting, my required repertoire. So yeah, I mean that. Yoga was super, super helpful.
It's interesting how it's like you can change that your mental state by just changing your physical state like that. Like you can put yourself in the right mental frame of mind in addition to the physical benefits just by having a practice like that.
Yeah, and I mean there's a lot to be said for going on a run too. For one, I mean you get out of the house. It's if you're practicing at home all the time, it could be a nice break to get out. So, I mean, especially if you're practicing hours a day. But yoga, being able to develop that mental focus also carried over, even if it was just subconscious. Being able to really have good balance, especially in developing sensitivity towards your instrument, was super, super helpful. Kind of like what I was talking about before, and having the instrument talk back to you. In yoga, having that balance definitely helped develop that sensitivity.
The two-way street analogy, I like that.
Right. Yeah, and that was a big thing that Laszlo taught me as well, is having balance. Just being in a very confident, supported equilibrium. You'll just have so much more control over getting your artistic vision out of the instrument.
I remember being struck by an article that Laszlo wrote for, it must have been Bass World or Asta or something like that, but he was talking about just like how large body motions affect everything on the bass, being grounded,
yes,
through your legs into the floor. It just really struck me. That was one of those that kind of, I copied that article and kept it in my practice binder for years. Is a really insightful, kind of holistic way of looking at you and the instrument.
Yeah. I mean, it's gold. I would be interested in getting that article from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That actually, I mean, that sounds fascinating. I had no idea that he was a writer.
I don't remember where. That was like my project in undergrad. I would like go scour the Northwestern Library and just like find interesting articles. So I have like these things from Paul Ellis, all these people from like the early 90s that I would just like carry around with me in my undergrad practice book. Yeah, I'll dig that up. I'll shoot you a copy.
Oh yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, Laszlo was super, super into, having that grounded movement. And basically, the whole premise being kind of like what I was saying before, is if you have support, it's going to free up the instrument. Especially considering his way of playing with the brick, which I know you've probably seen, and it's, essentially the whole concrete block with the pole coming out of it. Being able to free up the bass enough so that, you can still be sort of standing, have the bass supported, but have it be able to ring fully, as well as being able to move. Anybody that's seen him play in Aspen knows his leadership style in chamber symphony and how basically his flow in feeling the groove and how his whole body movement can affect the flow of the orchestra. His leadership style was very powerful, and it all comes from grounded movement.
I got one more question I like to ask, and it's like my only like quasi-scripted question, but like maybe go back to those undergrad years or early undergrad years. Like if you could give 18-year-old, 20-year-old Jon some advice, from your current perspective, what might you give?
Oh man, that would probably be my gut is telling me to say, don't worry so much.
Yeah.
When I was super, super young in undergrad, I was so gung ho about, knowing that I wanted an orchestral career, and, I would follow musical chairs all the time to get audition lists and stuff. And so in my audition binder, it's probably like a good 3 inches thick of just all of the bass standard repertoire. And so when I was younger, I would have a lot of practice days that were, there was one day I had where I practiced 10 hours a day, which I'll never do again, where, because I was just so tied up around, wanting an orchestral career, I worried too much about how I was doing things, what I was doing, where in the end, all you need to do is make sure that you're relaxed and sound good and be true to your artistic vision. Of course, that takes time to develop, but for me, when I was younger, I was tied up too much in making sure it was, quote, right. Whereas, if you're true to your artistic vision, a lot of that will probably fall into place naturally.
Jon, thanks for chatting. It was great to meet you at the Chicago Bass Festival. Can't wait to see what you're up to with all your various projects. Very exciting. And folks, if you want to follow along with everything we've done on the topic of auditioning, and we've done a lot here on the podcast, you can go to contrabassconversations.com/auditioning. By the way, you can also go to contrabassconversations.com/audition or auditions. So just remember the word audition, and you will be able to find this and all the other dozens of episodes on the topic, including my podcast series that I called Winning the Audition, which then became the book Winning the Audition. If you haven't checked out that book, winningtheaudition.net. You can check out the ebook, print book, and audiobook version of that if you'd love to hear my lovely voice narrate other people's words to you, which is very meta. Thanks for listening. I would love to hear from you. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com. Send me a message. I love hearing from people. I get emails every day from people who listen to this show across the globe, from the Netherlands to Australia to Canada to Argentina. Those are 4 emails that I got this last week alone. So I would love to hear your story, hear a little bit about you. That would be great. Thanks again for checking out this episode. I know Jon appreciates it. I appreciate it. I love having you along on this journey with me, and I can't wait for our next installment in this auditioning series. So we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.